Hey y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, manager at Ref and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking governance and change management in the Rose City. But before we get to the episode, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGO member. Engaging local government leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Michael Jordan is the city administrator for the city of Portland, Oregon, where he's responsible for leading Portland's voter-approved transition to a new form of government. Previously, he served as the city's chief administrative officer in the city's outgoing form of government and was the environmental services director for 7 years. He's also held leadership positions for the state of Oregon, Metro, the Portland area's regional government, and was the city administrator for the city of Canby, Oregon. So with that, Mr. Jordan, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me, Ben.
Yeah. So we have a tradition on the podcast to do a lightning round to get to know our guest a little bit better before we get to the hard-hitting questions. So I've got a couple of questions for you. What was the first concert that you went to?
Oh my gosh. You know how old I am, Ben. I can barely remember that far back. But I think I was a freshman at the University of Oregon and saw the Beach Boys at Matt Court.
Oh, nice. Oh, the old Matt Court, too. It wouldn't
the
have
old
been...
Matt Court, yeah. Exactly.
Very cool. All right, and then where do you go for inspiration?
Well, I'm a native Oregonian, so anywhere outside is good for me. We've got amazing beaches and mountains and deserts and the gorge and so many opportunities for hiking and getting into the forest. And so anywhere outside in Oregon is wonderful. Yeah.
You have a favorite spot?
I spend a lot of time around Bend and love Cannon Beach. Spend a lot of time there. And I live just like 20 minutes from wine country. And so getting out in the vineyards is always great too.
Yeah. No, it's lovely. And I'm a sucker for the gorge. So every time I'm in back home, I have to make a trip. But
it's beautiful.
All right. Well, and I'd give a little bit of your bio kind of in the introduction, but I always like asking folks how they ended up in this career and in this kind of field. So, from your perspective, how did you end up in working in local government and in the position you're in today for the city?
Oh my gosh. Well, I kind of came into public work through the side door. I was working at Pacific Power and Light Company in Portland and wanting to transition out of work in the engineering part of the organization and trying to get into community development, community relations, public relations work, and was having a very difficult time even getting an interview. And so I figured I needed to bolster my resume. So I ran for city council in my hometown in Canby and got elected. I was 28. And served 4 years and was about ready to run for mayor when the city administrator quit. And I loved the work and thought it might be nice to get paid to do it because in small towns you don't get anything for being on council. And so I can go into great detail. We don't need to do that here. But basically they offered the job to somebody else and they wouldn't take it for the money. So they gave it to me. And spent 10 years there learning the business really well. It was deep into the pool on the job training in a small town where you get to do everything basically as the city administrator. And I swallowed the hook and have been addicted to it ever since and love what I do and love the fact that every night I can look in the mirror and say, you got to spend your whole day trying to make your community a better place and got paid to do it. And I can't think of a better way to spend a life.
Yeah. Well said. So that's a really cool way in. So was there something that you got to work on in that role where you're like, this is the career for me. I want to stick with this forever. I don't know if something comes to mind.
Well, or most of your listeners probably know that when you're a city manager, city administrator, particularly in small towns, you're kind of on deck for everything. And so it's a very generalist kind of way. You have to know at least a little bit about almost everything, and that it fits my personality pretty well. I'm a mile wide and an inch deep. But the thing I loved about working in a small town, and what really addicted me, I think, was that somebody could come up to me in the grocery store on Saturday and say, I've got this problem, and on Monday morning I could have it fixed.
Cool.
And so, kind of the immediate gratification of working in small towns and being the city manager, that you can make things happen in a city, was just so addicting. And
Yeah.
over the course of the career, I've moved to bigger and bigger venues, which take you further and further away from the immediacy of that. And it's one of the things I miss about working in a small town.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in Canby back then, that's probably even smaller than,
Yeah, it was
than it
about
is today.
9,000 back then. So, and I'd lived there my whole life, so I knew everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, and then, I didn't realize you'd started as an elected official there. How does that kind of help your perspective in your role now, or even in your role back then, like having been on that side of it, of being a council member, or having to run for office, and now being on the administrative side?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, for that question. I've been elected twice. I was elected at the council level, and then was elected to county commissioner in Clackamas County.
Mm-hmm.
Also. And I think it is one of the great benefits for me at being able to be the chief executive officer for a government agency and reporting to elected officials directly, to have some empathy for the life that they live and the life cycle they live in. They live in 2 and 4 year life cycles. And so the world is much more immediate for them. They feel very accountable and very in the spotlight to their constituents. And those of us who work with them and for them, we're supposed to be here for the long haul. We're supposed to be kind of the stewards of the way we deliver service. And yet, at least in local government, that's a lot of what the electeds are held accountable for by their constituents. And so when you're in the manager mode, the management side of the house, it really helps to have empathy for that and understand the life that they have to live and try to relate to that for them. It's always made my relationship with the electeds a lot better, I think. And conversely, they understand the challenges and are willing to accept your thoughts about the challenges of implementation and the longer term implications of some of the things that they're working on at the council level. And that's always, the immediacy of the now, I like to call it the tyranny of the now, can often take over when you're an elected official, and you can lose a sense of what the long-term good is. And that can be a real challenge. So being elected before just gives me the ability to be empathetic, I think, a little bit more.
Yeah, I can totally see how that's like a superpower in working with them too. Is like having been in those shoes. Yeah. Well, I wanted to have you on to talk about kind of the transition for the city of Portland. So for listeners that haven't followed along, back in 2022, residents voted to change the form of government in the city of Portland from a commission form of government to what is mostly a council manager form.
They call it a mayor council form or council manager form, either way.
And this was, if memory serves, like this has gone to referendum a few times, and it's failed a few times, and this was the first time
I think this was the 8th or 9th time in 100 years that it had been on the ballot, and this was obviously the first time it passed.
Yeah. So, and maybe for our listeners that don't know, that the former form of government for the city of Portland was a little unique. So I don't know if it'd be helpful to maybe set the stage a little bit about like what the city used to operate under, and where you're headed. And we can talk more about the transition, obviously, but it was kind of a unique form of government in general before even the transition now.
Yeah, Portland before the transition was a commission form of government, and there had been a commission form since 1913. And What that is basically was a mayor and 4 commissioners, so a 5-member council. And the mayor's power, really, in the form of government only, was to assign or be able to remove responsibility for city bureaus, city departments, to the other commissioners. So the mayor would assign the bureaus to the commissioners, and they would act in what we called the commissioner in charge role, which basically gave them total authority over the bureaus that they were assigned by the mayor. And so they had managerial authority. They did policy work with their fellow members on the council, but they had day-to-day authority over the operation of the bureaus. Um, and as you can imagine, that would lead to some degree of fragmentation across the city, and it was difficult for bureaus to collaborate on complex problems when they had elected officials who had more at stake maybe than just solving the problem at hand. And there was a certain political overlay to everything the city did in that old form of government. However, it did have pluses. I think one of the reasons that Portland voters had voted change down so many times is that they felt that the elected officials were more directly accountable to the voters, and they had their hands on the levers to operate government, and that Portlanders felt that was a more direct line to the day-to-day operations of bureaus through elected officials. And so that direct accountability was a big thing for Portlanders for a long time, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm curious, you were serving the CAO role over the last year since the referendum to now. So over those 2 years, as the referendum passes, but there's this transition period.
Right.
Can you maybe, what was that kind of transition period like? How were you kind of prepping the organization and working with the council to be like, hey, this is where we're going in the next 2 years. And then obviously once we get there, it's a whole nother ball of wax, but what was that kind of like transition like?
Yeah, the transition was the most unique 2 years I've ever in my entire career in 40 years of doing this. That is until now, and we can talk about that later. Yeah. But the transition, when the ballot measure passed in November of 2022, and the first election under the new charter occurred in November of 2024, and those newly elected officials took office in January of this year. And so for those 2 years, first of all, we had a number of very technical things that had to be done. So the ballot measure mandated districts. It's the first time the city had ever had districts. So we had to have a separate commission appointed that had to create 4 districts, and they had to meet all the constitutional requirements for those districts. And we also had to change all of our election laws because the ballot measure required us to move from a standard traditional primary and runoff form of elections to a ranked choice voting form of elections. And that eliminated the primary, and everybody ran in the November general election for office. And we can talk more about that in a bit. So we had to change all of our election code, and we had to do that by about April of 2023. So only a few months after the election, we had to have all that code changed because we had to give it all to the county who administers the elections. And they had to change all their software so that they actually could administer a ranked choice voting election. So while it seemed like 2 years is a long time, there were a whole bunch of things that had to be done very early on so that everybody knew kind of what the rules of the game were for the November election. And the districts all had to be formed by August of 23 so that the lines could all be drawn. Voters would know which district they lived in. Potential candidates would know which district to run for. All of those things had to be done relatively early on. So we had a number of technical things that had to get done. And then one of the mandates of the measure was that the executive mayor had to appoint a professional city administrator, and they would be accountable for the day-to-day operations of the 7,000 employees for the city. And having been a city administrator and a chief executive for other governments, um, I knew that without the commissioners in charge, under the old city structure, organizational structure, we had 26 bureaus and offices, and they would have all reported directly to the city administrator. And that's just a ridiculous span of control.
Yeah.
And so it was not mandated by the charter change, but I knew from a practical perspective, we wouldn't get very many great applicants for that first city administrator if they looked on the website and saw that 26 bureaus and offices would report directly to them. They would realize that one of the first things they would have to do is reorganize the whole city.
Yeah.
And as you know, not many people survive that kind of work more than a couple of years, and then you pissed off enough people that you lose your head.
Yeah.
And so I thought, since I wasn't going to be the permanent administrator, that I would go ahead and do that organizational change, and that took a lot of the energy and a lot of the engagement with the leadership of all the bureaus and offices and with staff to do an organizational change. And what we proposed to the existing city council at the time in November of 23, a new framework that created 6 service areas. Your listeners will know them by heart, probably. They're very traditional. So public works and public safety, economic and community development, city operations, budget and finance, and something we called vibrant communities, which really had parks and a number of more soft services for the city in them. And so that's a relatively traditional framework, appointed deputy city administrators to oversee those. And we did it in November of 23. Wow. So that we could budget into that new structure and try to put it in place in July, which is the beginning of our fiscal year, July of 24, before the election even came. And what happened was Mayor Wheeler, who was the mayor at the time, used his authority to assign bureaus under the old structure. He assigned them all to himself and then delegated the authority to operate them to me starting July 1st of 24, which was 6 months before the actual ballot measure went into place. Huh. And so we did all of that to prepare the organization to run differently with a single point of accountability in an administrator and an organizational structure that had a layer of management that could oversee these service areas that had multiple bureaus in each one of them.
Yeah.
And then lastly, the last thing, those are the 2 big categories. The last big category of things to do in the transition was to prepare for 13 new elected officials, which had to walk in on January 2nd of 2025 and hold their first meeting and do business.
Wow.
And so we spent a lot of time preparing a curriculum to orient them to the city and to their role, their new roles, which didn't exist in the old structure, and all of the general things you need to understand, like ethical responsibilities and open meetings laws and all the rest of the things that elected officials need to understand. So we put them through a very intense onboarding process from just after Thanksgiving of 24 until just before Christmas. Wow. We had them almost every day in sessions to prepare them for their job and to be able to actually do business on January 2nd when they showed up for work at their first council meeting.
Oh my God.
So those are the 3 big categories. A lot of stuff. And
Yeah.
you can imagine that the old council, particularly when the mayor took all the bureaus away from them, there was a fair amount of tension and
Yeah.
anxiety and some anger about kind of having your job kind of taken away from you in preparation for a whole new regime. And then, of course, what is other underlying kind of tension is that three of the commissioners were running for the new mayor's job,
Oh, wow.
and one of them were running for one of the council seats. And so four of the five existing commissioners, as we were going through the transition, were running for office at the same time. And I'm sure your listeners all know what it's like to run a government when a bunch of folks are actually running for office at the same time.
Oh my God.
So that
I feel like
was,
just one of those buckets would be a lot of work for that
yeah.
period.
Fortunately, we had the council did authorize enough money for us to put together a transition team,
Mhm.
and they were amazing. We had about 15 folks over time, some more, some less than that over time, but they really took on all the component parts of this, and they just did an amazing job. Without those people, we would have never been able to make this as smoothly as we did.
Yeah. 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 I mean, wow. That's a ton of work and really impressive to get it all done in that 2 year. And I mean, some of the stuff you're talking about, like to get it done in a few months time, let
Yeah,
alone
there
2 years.
were those technical pieces were absolute drop dead deadlines. They had to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
done, and we got everything done on time and within the budgets. And the election went off very smoothly, no problems. We did a huge amount of voter outreach
Mm.
and education in collaboration with the county elections office and our auditor, where the city elections office is. We had a very collaborative effort to do huge amounts of outreach to voters to try and get them to understand what was ranked choice voting, what
Yeah.
was the new system going to be like, and that was a big lift too.
Yeah. Yeah, the public communication. Yeah, that's a great point. That's so much change that needs to be communicated to the public. That,
Yeah, we had comic strips. We had stuff on the sides of buses. We had,
yeah.
just website, all kinds of outreach, digital. We did contracts with community-based organizations to reach folks who were traditionally non-voters and folks who were hard to reach communities, language barriers. It was a huge deal, and the team just did an amazing job.
Yeah. Wow. Very cool. Well, and I also imagine so. There's obviously um, the public communication and outreach, but as you're kind of thinking through this restructuring and kind of even if you're just moving boxes on a page or someone's day-to-day
Sure.
supervisor isn't necessarily changing, the amount of change and communication that has to happen internally with employees,
Yeah.
like what was that kind of like? Because I imagine that's also a huge part of that period as well.
Yeah, it was. And fortunately for me, again, the team had a very solid communications component within it that really helped and developed. I would say they perfected the art of the digital town hall
Mm.
and being able to allow employees to go through a Q&A process. And we of course couldn't we would have anywhere from 500 to 1,500 employees on a Zoom call,
Wow.
allowing them to do Q&A and answering as many as we could online in real time, but then also answering all of their Q&As online so that people could go back and see the answers to all the questions.
Hmm.
Um, I did a lot of direct emails from myself. We would customize emails from directors of bureaus so that they could have direct communication with their employees in their own voice and be able to spin it because every one of the bureaus has a slightly different culture
Yeah.
sometimes radically different cultures,
Yeah. Yeah.
and having their bureau director be able to communicate about it helped a lot, I think. Um, we met regularly, every 2 weeks, I think, for a long time with those directors and leadership team, met in person, and they actually constructed the new organizational structure.
Hmm.
So they had buy-in into what we were putting in place, which was a huge help.
Yeah.
We created an internal newsletter, the City Insider. Um, we just used every channel we could, and tried to have the appropriate messengers with the right message at the right
Mhm.
time. And again, kudos to the comms group who really put together a communication strategy over the 2 years to try and make sure at least employees knew what was going on as it was going on.
Yeah.
And we engaged them when we could, but with 7,000 plus employees. And I used to be quoted and was told not to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, that the ballot measure put us in a box of having to do really big things at a stupid fast pace.
Yeah.
And so trying to keep everybody in the loop was really important. Even if they couldn't be engaged in every decision, at least they knew what was going on. And
Hmm.
so that was a big part of kind of keeping everybody on an even keel.
Yeah. Was that kind of the maybe, I don't know, to summarize, maybe the common questions you were getting from employees, like what's going on, what's kind of the latest update of the transition, or were there things that they were worried about in terms of their jobs or their departments and bureaus that,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. When we went into the process, particularly the reorganization process, back in late 22, early 23, I made it very clear to everybody that at that time we were responding to the ballot measure. We were restructuring so that a new city administrator could feel comfortable being held accountable for the entire organization.
Mhm.
But I did make it very clear in that process that it was not a force reduction process. It was
Yeah.
not about cutting jobs. Uh, Obviously, if we saw things that we could do differently, that we could be more efficient, we'd certainly take a look at those. But that was not the point of the exercise.
Yeah.
It was to prepare for the new government and to be able to budget into the new structure for the 24-25 budget year. Now we're going through some more change, and we always knew and we signaled that there would be further waves of change as we continued on with the new governmental structure. But now we're in a situation where that message is different.
Yeah.
We are doing further change, and a part of that is saving money. We're in a
Mm.
very challenging budget situation this year, and so a part of it is to save money and be more efficient, and some of that will be force reduction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great like kind of transition to like where we're at today. So as we were talking, it's May 1st, 2025.
Okay.
The new government has been in place for 5 months, or not quite, or I guess 4 months since the beginning of the year. Can you? What was that kind of like? What with the new council coming on board, and then like with the obviously you're having to do some different change management and different organizational stuff now, but the last months living in the new form of government, how's that gone? How's the organization kind of dealt with it?
Yeah, I have to say, and I said before that 2 years was maybe the most challenging 2 years ever in my career
Yeah.
until this year.
Yeah.
13 new elected officials.
13. That's so many.
We have a 12-member council that is supposed to be purely a legislative body with
Mhm.
policy and budget authority, and an executive mayor who is supposed to have all of the day-to-day authority, and has appointed me as the city administrator. And I did get confirmed by the council, so that went well. And I'm only here for this year, but I've never. it is just so, it's a whole nother layer of challenge beyond
Yeah.
running a big city and dealing with all the issues that you have to deal with. Um, this level of ambiguity about who's supposed to do what.
Yeah.
We've got about 2 paragraphs in the new charter that talk about the council and the mayor and the city administrator, and everything else we're kind of trying to make up. So the council elected a council president and a council vice president. There's no job description for that. The council divided themselves up into 8 substantive policy committees. They have chairs and co-chairs. There's no job description for what the chair is supposed to do. We're inventing how to process a policy idea to a piece of legislation that the council can ultimately vote on. How does that work? How does the executive branch move a necessary piece of legislation from the executive branch to the legislative branch? All of those processes we're making up. And one of the, I think one of your questions might be, what were some of the biggest surprises, or
Yeah. Yeah.
what are the biggest issues that I didn't anticipate? And I don't know that I didn't anticipate this, but I certainly didn't. I underestimated its importance. We knew in the transition time, every decision we made about the future state, we had to ask ourselves, how much do we bake this decision to completion, or how much do we leave it so that the new electeds can get their fingerprints on it?
Oh, interesting.
And I would say that I underestimated the desire of the new electeds to have their fingerprints on everything.
Huh.
And so a lot of the things that we did, we caught some flack from the electeds about they wanted to be a part of that decision. How could you do that without waiting for us? There was a lot of kind of tension at the very beginning about what we had done before they had gotten there, and how much they wanted to either change it or undo it or whatever. And so that's been another piece of just change management and finding cultural norms that I clearly underestimated before they arrived.
Huh. Is there an example of something that you were like, this won't be a big deal, let's knock it out now, and it turns out they really wanted to have their fingerprints on it?
Well, probably the one that was the biggest, and I don't know that I said this is no big deal. I was pretty sure it would be a big deal, but when we adopted the budget for the 24-25 year, that the new council would take over mid-budget year, right, on January 1st, we recommended that each counselor have two staff people for them. The council and the mayor decided at the time that, and we were in a tough budget year then also, but they decided to only allocate funding for one staff person for each counselor. And that was a big problem. And such a big problem that the council, in their second meeting, I think in January, amended the budget to give themselves another staff person each, and a bigger office budget, and that was so they were pretty unhappy with that, and of course they had budget authority, so they fixed it. But things like that around how we thought they might do business. They have a council operations office that we staffed. We knew that they would need that, but we anticipated maybe 4 or 5 committees, and we staffed it accordingly. Well, they decided to form 8 committees. And so now we're struggling a little bit, and we'll have to do something probably in this coming budget to account for the fact that they need more staff to be able to operate the way they want to. So just a lot of that kind of ambiguity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you asked about further change and this new budget. We are going through another challenging budget year. And one of the things that we knew we would do, but are now doing it in the context of having to save a bunch of money and rescale our efforts. We're taking pretty much all of the internal service systems, business systems, and restructuring them. They were structured originally, or evolved, I probably should say, originally in the context of what I call bureau land. So they were
Yeah.
done with the context of every bureau wanting its own thing, kind of.
Hmm.
And now we need to restructure those internal delivery systems um, from the enterprise context. And we know that many of the bureaus duplicated everything they ever wanted for themselves within themselves. And so we're sure that there is some duplication. But what we need, because of this budget challenge, is I've asked for 20% reductions in cost for the delivery of those services at an enterprise scale. And that's a pretty severe budget cut.
Yeah.
But we're not going to just water the soup. So we won't leave the system the way it is and just make it smaller. We
Hmm.
will actually take the time over the course of the year and redesign the systems to try and meet the needs at an enterprise scale and meet this target of a 20% cost reduction.
Wow.
And that's going to cause a fair amount of trauma. The reason we because we will be implementing those systems over the course of the next fiscal year, we won't receive the full benefit of those cuts this year. But
Yeah. Yeah.
next year in 26, 27, we will receive the full benefit of those reductions.
Huh.
And that, of course, has everybody very nervous. And we just rolled that out a couple of weeks ago and doing a lot of conversations with folks. And so think about technology, HR,
Yeah.
procurement, communications, equity, engagement, budget and finance,
Yeah.
those kinds of internal delivery systems we're restructuring.
Yeah. You're going from a decentralized approach to, hey, we're centralized this, and at the same time, like try
Yeah,
and reduce headcount.
not only restructuring to save money, but also changing the authority structure. Bureaus have been very used to doing things exactly
Yeah.
the way they want to do them without having to ask anybody else.
Hmm.
And now it's going to be a little tighter accountability and authority structure.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a great point. That you can't just you're not you have to work more independent or more interdependently
That's right.
in this structure than you did in the old one. And I
Yeah.
imagine there's probably departments or bureaus that didn't work together before that kind of need to now or should have been working together.
There's
um,
some pretty interesting challenges. Like one for instance is we have an emergency management bureau, but the Portland Police Bureau or the Water Bureau or whatever bureau that a particular event might be around. So let's say it's a civil disorder event,
yeah,
a demonstration. Traditionally, the police have handled that and they've done it all by themselves and not talked to anybody about what they were doing. And now we're trying to put that under the umbrella of an emergency management system
hmm,
and we try to respond to these things as a whole city. And that's proving to be, a cultural challenge, as you can
yeah,
imagine, getting people like police bureaus and utilities to work closely with everybody else in the city, depending on what the event um, is proving to be, a little bit of a cultural challenge.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's hard enough to do in a place that's not dealing with it, all this
Well,
change.
yes and no.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
done this in other places, done restructurings and
hmm,
reorganizations, and the first thing you have to do when you do that in an organization that's just kind of cruising along is you got to get everybody's attention,
Yeah.
and you've got to have a very solid answer to the why question.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
here, first of all, the ballot measure got everybody's attention all at once,
Yeah.
and the why question becomes much more evident.
Yeah.
And so this whole change of an entire government from the very top to the very bottom um, is it more makes it much easier to frame the why we have to do this question,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also the fact that we've got a significant budget challenge is part of it also. But even without that, the single point of accountability in a city administrator, the accountability of the administrator to the governing body and to the mayor, um, predicates that we do things differently and there be clearer lines of accountability through the organization, which quite frankly, we just didn't, they were not there under the old form of government.
Yeah. 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 And that's got to be a big change to to do that differently,
It's
even
a
if
big
there
change
is.
for everybody, and it will ultimately take years to get the
Yeah.
culture completely comfortable with that. Um, and so, we're just right at the front end of that process.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, knowing it'll take years, I'm curious to know, even let's round up and say 2.5 years into this. What have you maybe learned about change management and kind of, especially with such a large organization, like how, I don't know, what have you learned about kind of change management through this experience and as you're going through it now?
Yeah, well, communication is king, and
Yeah.
that's no surprise to anybody. Even when it's bad news. In fact, when it's bad news, it needs to come quicker.
Mm.
And so you just can't do it enough. Employees will fill an information vacuum with their worst nightmare, and it's usually much worse than anything you were going to do.
Yeah.
And so filling the void, even if it's somebody asks a question and you don't know the answer, to say I don't know yet. I will work on that, but I just don't know. Even if that's the answer, that's okay. So those kinds of things for sure. Um, Trying to engage as many um, either subject matter experts or leaders, no matter where they exist in the organization, trying to engage them as best you can in whatever questions can be framed for them to contribute to and feel like they've got fingerprints on and ownership.
Huh.
That's the other key. Um,
Mm.
we, people used to ask back right after the ballot measure passed, um, you know, how are you going to go about transforming the organization? And I would say, if somebody gave me 5 years to do this, I would say we probably can do a really good job and engage as many people as possible and make it as smooth as it can be. But we did it in like 16 months,
Yeah.
and that makes it harder, and people are more anxious, and you just have to put as many tools in place for them, places for them to go ask questions and talk to people, venues where they can be involved. You just have to try and create as many of those as you possibly can. um, and the response sometimes is mixed. I mean, when I
Mm.
put out something to all staff and explain some part of a change, I'll get a couple handfuls of emails back from people, and about half of them will say, "My gosh, thank you for all this. You're really communicating well. We so appreciate it." And about half of them will say, "Would you stop sending this stuff to me? I'm tired of it, and I know what you're doing, and so just leave me alone." And so it's a mixed bag, and you got to try and be empathetic to all of those situations that your employees find themselves in,
Yeah.
and so yeah, communicate a lot, try to be empathetic, engage as many people as you can in substantive conversations, and um, always contextualize what you're doing within
Huh.
a longer view. It's
Oh,
always
interesting.
easier for
Yeah.
people, I think, to not go to their corner and put on their gloves when they're upset if they can take whatever you're talking about in the moment and you can put it in a broader context and they can understand how it fits in a bigger destination that you're trying to get to. So that's another thing you try to communicate from the very beginning if you can.
Yeah.
How to contextualize every step.
Yeah. And like this change is part of this bigger
Yep,
picture
exactly.
of where we're going. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. That's good advice. Well, before we kind of wrap up, I do want to, you mentioned a little bit along the way around kind of your experience with the new council and the elected officials and what you did to kind of prepare them. But I am curious, as you've lived through the last the new form of government, and like what's it been like kind of helping them through this and this transition and their current role, and because obviously there's the change management with staff, but there's also change management with elected officials, and
Yeah.
I'm curious how that's going and what you've kind of or what you're doing with them as well.
I would say that's the piece that is most ambiguous and most still under construction.
Yeah.
The individual personalities of all of the electeds, and particularly for the council, how those personalities can meld into a body that can actually make public policy and deliberate on it in a rational way, engage the public in that policy making process. All of those kind of dynamics are so in flux right now that it's just really difficult. My gut and my experience tell me that this will all settle down over time and people will find a rhythm and a cultural norm for how they do their work. But right now there is no history. There are no elected officials here to bring the new ones along. They're all new. Yeah. And so I spend a fair amount of my time and energy trying to think through how can we help the legislative branch do their job, and how do the branches relate to each other, and where are the boundaries? There are some clear ones in the charter, but very few. And when a elected body, a legislative body, has authority over the budget, I'm sure your listeners know that the budget has these kind of tentacle connections to practically everything you do in one way or another.
Yep.
And yet they are prohibited by the charter from being involved in the operation of city government. And so where's the boundary between those things, and how can the budget be used to manipulate the operations of the city? And we've got, let's just say, some folks with experience in local government in other places or in past at the city of Portland that have opinions about how the operation should run day to day. And sometimes they try to figure out a way to exert their opinion into either legislative policy or into the budget. And so we're going to go through our first budget starting next week with the council. The mayor proposes his balanced budget on May the 5th, next Monday, and the council begins deliberations on it. And it will be fascinating to see how that all works with 12 of them and a budget that has pretty significant cuts in it. So
yeah, that will be fascinating. We'll have to stay tuned and maybe have you back once some of those bruises have healed.
Well, if I'm still here, happy to come back.
Well, awesome. Well, before we wrap up, I have the hardest question of all of our interviews.
Okay.
If you could be the Gut Love DJ and pick the exit music for this episode, what song would you pick?
Okay. I got a heads up on this. So I'm a kid of the 70s. So it would be Spirit in the Sky by Norman Greenbaum.
Awesome. That's a great one. Perfect. Well, our producer got that queued up, and that ends our episode for today. Mr. Jordan, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
It's been really fun. It's my pleasure, Ben. Thanks.
And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or at our GovLove podcast page on LinkedIn. That's a great way to never miss a new episode. And again, your membership really supports this podcast. So if you want to hear more great conversations like the one we had today, please sign up to be an ELGL member. Please subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app as well. If you're already subscribed, go tell a friend or a colleague about this podcast. You can help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.